China's economic model that it's kind of brought, from the past to the present day, is a very traditional one. I mean, not like widespread necessarily, but one that we're very familiar with, which is a high saving, high investment economic model, which it certainly was during the 2000s, highly dependent and driven by exports.
China's rise to global superpower once looked completely unstoppable. But after decades of extraordinary levels of economic growth, the narrative is beginning to disappear. China is facing quite extraordinary headwinds from growing geostrategic and trade tensions, authoritarian leadership, and an aging population. Now the collapse of Evergrande, the large-scale debt-driven property developer, has sent shockwaves through the Chinese and global economy. Welcome back to the IEA podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Communications here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalising policy question to tackle a key global issue. Today's question is China in jeopardy? To discuss, I'm very excited to be joined by George Magnus, who's an associate with the China Centre at the University of Oxford, a former chief economist with UBS, as well as the author of Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy. He's also a regular commentator across a wide variety of publications. Welcome to the podcast, George. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks very much for having me.
So before we get into a bit of the longer term picture, I'm interested to get your thoughts on, I suppose, what the current economic crisis facing China is. It seems like things that were meant to be going quite well post-COVID as a sign of success has really taken a negative turn.
Yes, I think the immediate problem or proximate problem, I think, in China, which has occupied a lot of thinkers and media sources over the summer, is just that the expected bounce back from the abandonment of zero COVID at the end of 2022 just didn't really materialize. I mean, there was a bit of a flurry of consumer spending in the early part of this year, as people were allowed to congregate again and use transportation and get out of their residential compounds and so on. But it really didn't extend to consumer durables like housing, automobiles, and so on. And after sort of February, March, just things just got worse, actually. And I mean, it's not like the economy was in sort of deep contraction, although at least on official numbers, it looks like the economy was stagnant for quite a few months since February and March. And the proximate cause of that really is the kind of real dive that's taken place in the real estate market, which is now probably the first big downturn in real estate. We've had downturns before, but never like this, since what was a kind of a housing welfare market was created into or transformed into a proper market as we understand it. Anyway, so to put all these things together, so the economy was really weak in the second quarter, pretty much stagnated. Official figures show that it rose by barely 3% at an annualized rate. Private forecasters think it probably didn't even manage to do that. I think more recently, it looks like, kind of the fears that China's economy was about to collapse, proved to be rather exaggerated. It's not collapsing. And there is going to be, and there have been already, kind of stimulus measures to try to ease the pressure in the housing market. So it faces quite a number of headwinds, but we are somewhere between collapse and euphoria. It's neither one nor the other.
Muddling along, perhaps. Let's just quickly, I suppose, at least briefly get into what's been going with the housing market. So I think there's some claims that perhaps a quarter of the Chinese economy or economic growth was coming from the property sector. But that seemed to be this kind of idea of building these ghost cities of tower blocks and people putting a lot of money into, and even quite extraordinary from a Western perspective, basically pre-purchasing a property, already paying mortgage repayments on an apartment you have, but that apartment not actually existing yet.
Yeah, so the so-called pre-sale model in the Chinese real estate market is something that's it's quite unusual, I think, for us at least. So even before construction has started, or when apartments or houses are only kind of partially built, I mean, you can actually contract to buy that unit and take out a mortgage on it, and you won't be delivered until obviously the property is complete. So just before COVID came, so if we look at 2019, 2020, probably about 90% of real estate purchases in China were of this nature. They were pre-sales. So as the developers, now you mentioned before Evergrande. Evergrande is just happens to be the largest private developer with the biggest liabilities, about $300 billion. But there are plenty of others. I mean, private developers, a lot of them are in trouble. So there's a lot of inventory and a lot of uncompleted properties. And in fact, last year, there was quite an extended period of time when hundreds of thousands of mortgage owners actually refused to pay their mortgages on the basis that they weren't going to get delivered the properties that they'd contracted to buy. So this is something which the government has kind of acted fairly promptly to try to address, because obviously it does not want a disaffected middle class, for whom housing has been kind of a big issue and a major form of saving and wealth accumulation. So it's been trying very kind of adroitly, really, to try to get the developers who are either bankrupt or illiquid to give them sufficient, funds, resources, organizational restructuring to ensure that these properties do get delivered to citizens. So this the problem about in the real estate market obviously is that the developers are in trouble. There's a lot of inventory, particularly in hundreds of towns and cities that tourists who go to China never really visit or never used to visit. So smaller towns and cities, in fact. And of course, there are structural kind of constraints now on the sector by virtue of the fact that household formation rates have plummeted because of the declining birth rate.
So, what do you think this kind of, I says, we can learn from this, I guess, current situation about the state of China's economic model? Because it seems to me that if China probably wants to be on you hear a lot about the technologies of the future, high tech. Obviously, there's a big Chinese manufacturing sector, but at the same time, a lot of their economy seems to be in this kind of property bubble. There's also, you see a lot of discussion about how little consumption there is in China compared to elsewhere in the world. Chinese consumers are quite frugal, and the whole economic model is kind of built around this kind of infrastructure, property, and I suppose producer-related goods. Whether or not that's kind of like a sustainable economic model going forward, or whether there's really like deep structural issues in the economy that the government's going to really struggle with.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of issues here. The first is obviously China's economic model that it's kind of brought, from the past to the present day, is a very traditional one. I mean, not like widespread necessarily, but one that we're very familiar with, which is a high saving, high investment economic model, which it certainly was during the 2000s, highly dependent and driven by exports. But actually, after the financial crisis, which did touch China in a very material way, but not as the same way that we experienced it in the form of a banking crisis. But since that time, that sort of tilt in the model really has been away from the export-led growth towards more investment-led. And so the share of investment in China's economy now is about 44 or 45%. This is substantially higher than it was in the case of the so-called Asian tiger economies when they were at a similar stage of economic development, and significantly higher than it is in let's say India, which is now viewed as the next sort of big emerging market power in Asia and parts in the world. So and a lot of the investment that has kind of fueled that boom during the last 10 or 15 years has been in real estate and infrastructure. A lot of it is uncommercial, debt driven, et cetera, et cetera. And we kind of know that this is something not quite going right here, because the investment efficiency, as we measure it, I mean, very nerdily, since I'm talking to an IEA audience. So the incremental capital output ratio, in other words, the amount of capital you get out of amount of GDP you get out of each additional unit of investment, has been declining quite steadily in recent years. So this model really isn't delivering for China the kind of growth rates and employment structure that are consistent with the aspirations which China has, and which are certainly reflective of its past performance. And as you say quite correctly, because the investment share of GDP is so high, the consumption share of GDP is relatively low. Certainly low to China's peer group like Mexico, Turkey, and other countries with similar income per capita. So it's not necessarily that Chinese consumers are frugal. I mean, we've seen consumer spending growing in China in recent years. I mean, up until the pandemic and since, obviously, it's a different matter. But before that, by about sort of 7 or 8% per annum in real terms, which is pretty feisty. But income growth has slowed down. The occupational structure of the workforce has changed, is changing more towards low pay, low skill work rather than high pay, high skill in manufacturing and construction. And yeah, I mean, I think that the model basically is not delivering for China anymore, and it needs a makeover in which you have to basically redistribute income, change the tax system, which is very regressive, change the system of central-local government relations, which are tipped very heavily towards local governments which produce or spend a lot of the state money, but the central government which gets the lion's share of revenue and so on. So lots of things that are kind of structurally not quite working in China anymore, and which are probably contriving to drive it towards, certainly now, driving it towards a much more pedestrian, sustainable growth rate in the future of maybe 2 or 3%.
Which would be fine in the West, but by China's standards, I think it's often easy to forget that China is still significantly poorer than Western countries.
Indeed, and I would make the further point, really, that although 2 to 3% could be a very benign outcome if the quality of that growth is good, it could also be a very unsatisfactory outcome if you don't make the necessary economic reforms to make it more sustainable. In other words, if you keep piling up debt to finance, wasteful real estate and infrastructure investment, even that 2 to 3% in the medium term, could end you up with a balance sheet crisis or an economic crisis and so on. Which just reminds me about the second point I was going to make, which is, of course, just like Japan in the 1980s or the 1990s, there is this curious coexistence, really, of two things that are true. One is that China is certainly capable of extraordinary, and has proven it's capable of extraordinary accomplishments in science, engineering, technology, and so on. But it also has kind of a macroeconomic governance structure and economic structure which could end up in a lot of trouble. And that's precisely what happened to Japan, even though there are dissimilarities between the two examples.
So I suppose the kind of central question at the heart of this is can China escape the middle income trap? Can it manage to get its economy it's gone from extreme dirt poverty, lifted hundreds of millions of people into high quality of life. A lot of to do with that was the economic reform agenda of the reform and opening becoming a global, I suppose, at least to some extent, market-driven economy. What strikes me, and you identify this in red flags, is a whole bunch of reasons why that's not likely, or not necessarily not likely to be the case, but it's going to be very difficult. Now, the first one to think about, in my mind, is probably the aging and the demographics issue. And most recently, we saw this when comparing the fact that India's population has jumped above China's, and maybe China was exaggerating their population numbers as well.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I don't I don't lose a huge amount of sleep over, the size of China's population in the next like 10 or 20 years. I mean, certainly there are very long-term projections in which, India becomes by a considerable margin a much more populous country than China, and potentially that gives India a lot of opportunity. I mean, obviously, still has to be seized, still has to be created, but the raw material of high population growth and high working age population growth is generally deemed to be a positive, provided all those people can find work. So, in the long term, that is certainly a potential problem. I think the issue for me, though, really is much more about the consequences of or the macroeconomic consequences of aging, right? So there are two kinds of problems that we've got with aging societies. One is who's going to look after grandma and grandpa, which is something that everybody has an issue with.
Yeah.
And this is really about the affordability of the old age care system and healthcare and so on. And China has issues with that, of course, as we all do. But the other issue is, what do you do to compensate for the progressive and relentless decline in the working age population, because the fertility rate is so low that you can't replace the increasing proportion of workers who are going into retirement. And in China, people go into retirement or get their pensions much earlier than they do in a lot of other places. So although they've talked about raising the eligibility rate age for a long time, you can still retire in China at 60 if you're a man, and 55 or 60 if you're a woman, depending on the kind of work you were doing when you were in employment. So one of the things that most countries have done, I mean, I call them coping mechanisms, right? So one of the things that most countries have done have basically been to increase steadily the retirement age or pension eligibility age, so that you can kind of keep older people who are typically underrepresented at work, you keep them on at work for longer, because you can, and because they have greater longevity.
Of course, that's extremely politically toxic, as we've seen in France more so recently. But even in the UK, there have been moves to increase the retirement age. And it's understandably controversial that people feel like they've got an entitlement that they're looking forward to in 5-10 years' time becomes 10 to 15 years' time. I think, though, perhaps, and in my mind, what is quite an interesting economic issue, particularly from, I suppose, an IEA perspective, the extent to which, and we haven't really talked about it yet, which is that President Xi's economic policy appears to have meaningfully changed. The China appears to have gone from this era of reform and opening, and being, I suppose, quite open to international companies, quite open to domestic entrepreneurs, to a situation today where you have someone like Jack Ma, who disappeared and then went very quiet in terms of his criticism of the Chinese government, where there's a lot of trade tensions over China's position in the world. Obviously, there's the geostrategic issues with Taiwan there, but more domestically, it seems like President Xi isn't going to necessarily do the kind of reforms that would enable economic growth, that they're going for a more state-driven or CCP-driven economy.
That's unquestionably true. And I think most sinologists kind of recognize now that the things that Xi Jinping is really interested in, really concerned about, are things like national security, stability, and order and control, and not necessarily growth-oriented policies that characterized the past. So kind of in a very kind of nerdy way, one of the kind of current issues of interest is, why don't they stimulate the economy more? Well, they are going to stimulate the economy a bit in the second half of this year, and actually have started already. But they're not going to go kind of full throttle to the kind of reckless monetary and fiscal stimulus which kind of got them into this leverage problem in the first place. Because it's destabilizing to the financial system, destabilizing for capital outflows and so on. So China is very kind of conservative with a small c, both in terms of its approach to macroeconomic policy, but also with regards to the way it sees, say, social security and welfare, which it sees as a sort of a Western evil that encourages laziness and.
This is an intriguing fact, isn't it? That the communist or socialist country has much less of a welfare state than the UK or France.
It's an irony, and I think I was going to also say, because you mentioned before about the middle income trap, and can China avoid it? The big issue that all countries face when they grow out of poverty into this kind of middle income area is, what do you do for an encore? Once you've kind of physically exploited most of your labor and capital, how do you actually sustain economic growth and smart growth in the future? And of course, we know the answer to that is productivity, which, if it were that achievable, nobody would have a problem. So the problem with China is it's run into a kind of a big brick wall in terms of productivity. And I think a lot of economists think that productivity is really not so much about it isn't about how much you produce, but actually how robust your institutions are, legal institutions, competition institutions, education institutions, et cetera, how robust these institutions are in nurturing entrepreneurial capacity, know-how, innovation, and so on and so forth. And here you've got a kind of, in China, a very marked shift under Xi Jinping away from the pre-existing kind of regime, so to speak, of where private entrepreneurs were kind of courted and welcomed and given pretty much free rein, to a much more controlling Leninist orthodox structure of production and control and state enterprise-led growth, which is going to be very difficult to dislodge. I mean, these are existential for Xi Jinping's China. I'm not saying it needs to stay like this forever, but certainly for as long as he's in control, I don't really think this is going to change at all. And I think this is prejudicial to China's growth prospects and its efficiency in the future.
I suppose there's a bit of debate here about whether or not, in a sense, this was always the plan, whether or not the era of let's get rich has effectively come to an end. China's kind of happy with how rich it's become, and it only allowed the private sector to prosper in the 90s and into the 2000s, purely to give the country a bit more resources it could then use. And now it's the natural conclusion here, and you can trace this back to the reaction to Tiananmen Square. There was never an intent to liberalise. And I think this is, from a free market perspective, one of the great disappointments of our era is, while we saw this kind of trend in other parts of Asia where authoritarian countries liberalised on economics and then they eventually liberalised on politics as well, China's probably gone in the opposite direction here, where they started liberalising on economics. They've never really started liberalising that much on politics, and then have just gone into full-scale reverse in terms of deliberalising or increasing authoritarian control.
Yeah, I mean, factually, that's exactly what has happened. I think it's kind of intriguing as to kind of why and how it happened, because certainly under the previous government of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, which is from 2002 to 2012, I mean, there wasn't a huge amount of reform going on during that period. There were quite a lot of initiatives to build out and to broaden the social security system, pensions, healthcare, education, and so on, to a degree. But there was also, it was also kind of fat cat times, right? A lot of people got rich. It was kind of boom time in China, as it was in much of the rest of the world. And it gave rise to a lot of kind of political controversy, which, with Xi Jinping coming to power in 2012, he was determined to reverse. He wanted to restore party discipline. He wanted to kind of put the corruption and sort of bad behavior, as they might have called it, of private sector back into some kind of order. They didn't want to kind of suppress private enterprise, but private enterprise needed to be supportive of the party and so on and so forth. But I think that whilst that happened, whilst that was certainly the political agenda, it's also true that as the economic model started to falter after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the more the economy or that model started to falter, the more repressive politics became. So that's sort of a self-feeding loop, really, between repression and faltering economic performance, which has kind of brought us to where we are today.
It seems to me, in the longer run, the biggest, I suppose, economic effect from China on the global economy could very well be the potential for some kind of conflict. I know not necessarily your area of expertise. You're probably more focused on the direct economics here. But I think we're already seeing a bit of impact from China even today in their current policies on the global economy. It seems like it's such a substantial part of it that if China slows down, the rest of the world will slow down. There's efforts towards decoupling from China. I think that's probably increasing costs, and we saw that era of very global low inflation. Now, I think one of the theories, the reason why we saw that era of low inflation was because China was exporting relatively cheap goods to the world, and that kept prices down. Now, the extent to which we're seeing a reversal of that, and I suppose a deglobalization to some extent, or restructuring of supply chains. How do you think the rest of the world is going to end up feeling as a result?
Well, I think it's inevitable that we are moving into, or we are in a world which is going to be less efficient and more costly than the one that we kind of left, really, and that's bound to happen if you start introducing, as both sides have done, export controls or barriers to free exchange of commerce and trade. I mean, today, there's sort of a news story about Chinese government banning Apple phones in government offices. We've done the same, or some Western countries have done the same with Huawei phones and so on. So this kind of tit for tat sort of
low-level economic war.
Yeah, economic war, and basically the sort of emphasis that both the kind of liberal-leaning democracies and China are placing on national security, and that sort of broader encompassing of national security to include technology and commerce and anything that could have military applications, which is a lot of things, including climate modeling, and so on and so forth. So I think that I don't think this is going to change really. Now, whether that means, and I think it probably does mean, that this creates higher cost structures in the future, particularly as supply chains are recalibrated. I mean, I don't think this is something which is going to happen in a moment, but we certainly have seen and have started to see examples of firms diversifying their supply chains to non-China countries in Asia, but also to Mexico and Turkey and places that are closer to home. Some of it is enabled by technology, 3D manufacturing, climate change considerations about shipping goods across the world and so on. And some of it obviously is political. So yeah, I think this is a world in which costs are going to have a bid that they didn't have before.
Yeah, it seems like a quite fundamental shift. I was wondering, just as I suppose some concluding thoughts in terms of you wrote your kind of red flags book back in 2018, which I think was quite enlightening, and it came, I suppose, before a lot of these issues were identified. When there's anything in there that you think what we've learned since, were there things that you didn't necessarily get right, or different things that have now changed that are worth emphasizing a bit more about the long-term trajectory of China?
A couple of things, I think, which I probably didn't have sufficiently sort of lasered eyes on, and it wasn't as relevant then. I mean, not as kind of prominent, I should say, as it has become. The first is this kind of very, very sharp focus that we all have now on national security and DIY, basically, right? So, Bidenomics is really about doing more on climate change and chips and semiconductors at home or in friendly countries, right? So cutting China out of the geography of supply chains in the future. But China is much the same in terms of trying to articulate and implement its own policies of self-reliance. So this drive to separate in terms of not just trade, but FDI, foreign direct investment, standards, protocols, technology, and so on, I think is something that has gathered quite a lot of momentum since 2018-19. The other thing is the governance structure in China, which I kind of thought was changing when I wrote the book. There were already very strong telltale signs. But I think the degree to which the Communist Party under Xi Jinping has moved to basically bring the private sector and entrepreneurs to heel is something that I would probably make a bigger deal about if I was writing about it now, and do, but obviously not in that book. But I think that's really it's quite interesting because this year there's been a bit of a charm offensive waged by the government to try to persuade private firms and entrepreneurs that you're really on our side, we're on your side, we all want to work together, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think it really changes the direction that the party has taken, which is to marginalize the private sector and to allow it to make money, provided it conforms to the party's goals and aspirations. So we might call that, taking them over from the inside.
Well, indeed, all Chinese companies are required by national security laws to do what they're told by the CCP and contain party units within them. So, I mean, it seems like the entire industrial or market structure has to be interconnected to government.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously something that I think we all have to be conscious of in Britain and elsewhere as well, which is, and it does risk a bit of sort of going over the top because I mean, unless we end up actually having an outright conflict with China, which I think we all think hopefully will be avoided, but we do have to be careful and cautious about where our red lines are in terms of technology transfer and commercial exchange and so on, because we simply don't know what state actors or private actors that could be co-opted by the state in China would do with the information or technology that we provide.
On the other hand, though, you probably don't want to completely, disassociate and practically impossible, I suppose, for so many companies. If you're buying toys, for example, there's no reason not to buy them from China if they're producing a quality product at a low price. If there's no national security implications, you've got to distinguish there.
Of course, I mean it's very much horses for courses, and I mean I don't think there isn't a case for saying that all trade is bad. I mean, if you're selling luxury goods, handbags, cars to Chinese consumers. Cars is probably going the other way now in terms of electric vehicles. But yeah, there are a lot of goods and services which can be provided in a which don't have any national security implications whatsoever. Equally, there are many that are that do have it, and some that are probably on the cusp.
Well, George Magnus, thank you so much for joining the IEA podcast. For those who are interested in learning more, you've written obviously quite extensive in recent months about the current state of the Chinese economy, as well as your book, Red Flags, which gives a bit of the longer view. If you are enjoying this podcast, please do subscribe in your chosen podcast provider, or to learn more about the IEA, just visit iea.org.uk.